Hospitals are meant to heal. They are places where hope lingers in sterile halls, where tired hands fight to keep life from slipping away. But when the last visitor leaves, when the lights dim and only the hum of machines remains, hospitals change. They take on another life, one that the living are not meant to see. Nurses who have worked the night shift for decades still whisper about the ICU wing, where a patient's call bell kept ringing hours after he had already been pronounced dead. Some swore they heard his voice asking for help. Others saw the bed sheets move, as if someone still lay beneath them. And yet, no one was there. Tonight, we're not just recounting stories. We're stepping into the dark silence of hospitals after midnight, where monitors beep without reason, wheelchairs roll down empty corridors, and unseen hands tug at uniforms. These aren't tales meant to entertain. They're real accounts, passed between staff in hushed tones, reminders that not every shift is survived with reason intact. Stay with me until the very end, because the last story, the one about a nurse who quit her career, overnight, still refusing to work shift, alone leaves staff the graveyard. If you're watching this alone, you might want to subscribe now. Not for me, but so you're not watching what comes next without protection. Because once these stories start, you can't unhear them. Story 1. The ICU Call Light. The ICU is not like any other floor in a hospital. It carries a heaviness, a weight that you feel the moment you step through its double doors. The lights are always dim, never fully bright, as though the walls themselves are trying to soften the truth of what happens there. Machines hum, pumps beep, and the faint smell of disinfectant lingers in the air. Always fresh, always sterile, but never enough to mask the underlying scent of fear and exhaustion. On this particular night, it was 2:30 in the morning. The nurse on duty had been working the ICU for years, and she knew that this hour, the dead hour, as many called it, was the quietest time of all. Patients were sedated, monitors showed steady rhythms, and the hallways were still. The only sound was the low, constant drone of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She sat at the nurse's station, sipping lukewarm coffee, eyes heavy, when she saw it. A call light flickered on. Room 6. Now, for anyone outside of healthcare, a call light is simple. It's a small button near the patient's bed. If they need help, they press it, and at the nurse's station, a soft chime rings and the number illuminates. Standard, routine. Except, room 6 had been empty for hours. The patient who once lay in that bed had passed away earlier that evening. His family had come, said their goodbyes, and the room had been cleaned. Nothing was inside but freshly folded sheets. Room. The nurse froze, staring at the glowing number 6 on the board. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe another nurse had gone in to restock. Maybe a cleaner had bumped the switch. But when she looked down the hall, the door to room 6 was wide open. The room was dark, silent, empty. She hesitated, then stood, her footsteps echoing down the polished floor. Every sound felt louder than usual, the creak of her shoes, the rustle of her scrubs. She reached the doorframe and flicked on the overhead light. The room glared back at her, spotless and unoccupied. Nothing on the bed, nothing on the monitor, no movement at all. She stepped inside, telling herself to breathe. At the bedside, she checked the call button. It was untouched, no sign it had been pressed. And yet, at the nurse's station, the board was still glowing red. Room 6. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the light went off. She walked back to the station, unsettled, but she didn't want to give in to nerves. ICU nurses were tough. They had to be. But 5 minutes later, it happened again. Room 6 lit up, glowing like a beacon. This time, she wasn't alone. Another nurse looked at her and frowned. "Did you see that?" They both knew the truth. The room was empty, but the call light was asking for help. Together they went down the hall. 2 sets of footsteps, 2 held breaths. They entered the room, and once again, nothing. The sheets were still smooth, tucked tight, the machines unplugged. the silence so deep it pressed against their ears. But when they turned to leave, the call button on the wall, right by the bed, clicked. Both nurses froze. They had heard it. The small, sharp click of the button being pressed. The light at the station glowed red again. Neither of them spoke, but their eyes said everything. Someone or something had just pressed that call light. The nurses reported it to their supervisor, who brushed it off as faulty wiring, but deep down they weren't convinced. In hospitals, things malfunction all the time, but not like this. Not repeatedly, not when you hear the button click under invisible fingers. For the rest of the shift, Room 6 called for help, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes hours. No matter how many times they went inside, the room remained untouched. The bed stayed empty, and yet, the light always came back on. Other staff began noticing it too. Night after night, Room 6's call bell would sound, sometimes long, after the floor had gone still. Some refused to answer it, quietly begging another to check instead. One even swore she saw the shadow of a figure sitting on the bed, only for it to vanish when she turned the light on. But the strangest detail came weeks later. A nurse who had cared for the patient in Room 6 swore he had been clutching the call button in his hand when he died, desperate, still trying to get someone's attention, right up until his final breath. And maybe, just maybe, he never let go. See, call light button keeps going off in an empty room. The first time she told herself it was nothing, a glitch in the system, maybe a short in the wiring. She reset the board, checked the room, and forced herself to laugh it off. But when the call light from Room 6 rang a second time, only minutes later, her stomach dropped. The ICU was too quiet for jokes. The halls were long and sterile, polished to the point where her reflection stretched faintly across the floor as she walked. And every time the bell rang, the sound echoed against those walls in a way that felt wrong, too sharp, too demanding, as if the building itself wanted her to answer. She walked back down the corridor. The door to Room 6 was still ajar, the darkness inside pressing against the faint light from the hallway. She reached for the switch, and again the room bloomed into a sterile brightness. The bed was empty, the sheets tight, the monitor dark. Nurse resets it, comes back, it rings again. She reset the button once more, stood there longer this time, listening. Nothing but the steady hum of the vents. But as she turned to leave, the light at the nurse's station blinked red again. She hadn't even made it halfway back down the hall. Her breath caught. It wasn't a glitch. Something was calling, something that wanted her attention. When she returned, she pressed her hand against the button, feeling the cool plastic beneath her fingers. She whispered out loud, though no one was there, "There's nobody here. You don't need help anymore." She clicked reset, and for nearly 20 minutes, silence returned. The nurse allowed herself to relax, sipping what was left of her coffee, though her eyes kept drifting toward the glowing board. One by one, the other lights flickered as real patients stirred. Room 2 asking for water, Room 4's ventilator alarm. Routine, real, things she could see, things she could touch. But just as she settled back into the rhythm, Room 6 lit up again. The sound wasn't louder, but it felt louder, sharper, piercing, like a voice raised in frustration. She glanced at the other nurse across from her, who had now noticed too. The woman shook her head. "I'm not going in there," she muttered. So she went alone. The walk down the hall felt longer this time, her shadow stretching in front of her like something leading her in. She stepped through the door. Same emptiness, same smell of antiseptic and fresh sheets. She checked the bed, flat, the pillow uncreased, then her eyes dropped. The call button cord, normally tucked neatly against the bed rail, was lying across the mattress, resting in the center of the bed. Her heart skipped. She had checked earlier. It had been clipped to the side, untouched. Now it was resting where a patient's hand would be. She stepped closer, swallowing the lump in her throat. With a trembling hand, she picked it up, clipped it back onto the rail, and reset it again. The light on the board went dark. But she didn't leave right away this time. She stood still, watching, half daring whatever force lingered there to show itself. The room was silent, empty, calm, until, click. The sound came from directly under her hand. The call button clicked again, the red glow returning instantly. Her knees nearly gave out. She had felt it, the button pressing down. But her own fingers hadn't moved. She stumbled back from the bed, her breath ragged, eyes darting. Across the corners of the room, still empty, still untouched. She fled into the hall, the door swinging shut behind her. At the nurse's station, the light for room 6 was still glowing defiantly. This time, she didn't reset it. She couldn't. She sat there frozen, staring at that board. And then, things got worse. Because room 6 wasn't the only one. Moments later, room 8 lit up. Then room 3, then room 10. Every empty bed in the ICU began calling. One after another, lights flashing red across the board. And for the nurses on that shift, the question was no longer why was room 6 calling. It was, answering? Who else was? Do you hear that ringing in your head too? If you're brave enough to keep listening, prove it. Subscribe right now. And if you won't, go to the comments and tell us why. Maybe the rest of us should know what's keeping you from clicking. The paranormal moment. The hallway was dead silent when it happened. First, the faintest sound. Just a whisper of movement. Then the long, slow creak of metal hinges. One of the doors was moving. The sound carried down the empty corridor, echoing like a warning. Room 6, the door she had shut tight only minutes ago, was opening again. Inch by inch, the heavy frame groaned as though pushed from the inside. The nurse froze. Her breath caught in her chest as the gap widened, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. No light, no movement, just a shadowy void where the room should be. She took one hesitant step forward, shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. Each step seemed louder than it should have been, as if the entire ICU had fallen into complete silence, waiting for her. And then she heard it. At first it was so faint, she thought she imagined it, a soft exhale buried beneath the hum of the fluorescent lights. She stopped walking, listened harder. There it was again, shallow, uneven, a rhythm that didn't belong to her. Her skin prickled. The air felt heavy now, cold enough to sting her arms. She glanced behind her, empty hallway, no one else, no patients awake, no staff approaching. The sound was coming from inside room 6, closer this time, louder. Not the deep, controlled breathing of sleep. This was different. Like someone standing in the shadows, struggling to pull air into lungs that no longer worked. Her pulse raced. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away, but her legs moved forward anyway, carrying her to the threshold. She whispered, barely above her own breath, "Hello? Is someone in there?" Silence. Then, one ragged inhale, sharp and wet, as though whatever was inside the room was just feet away from her. Her hand shook as she reached for the switch and flicked the light on. The room glared back at her. Empty bed, sheets tucked tight, monitors unplugged, no one there. But the breathing hadn't stopped. It was still there, closer, now, louder. And it wasn't coming from the bed. It was coming from the space just behind her shoulder. The back of her neck turned cold. The tiny hairs on her skin stood upright. She didn't dare move, didn't dare turn her head. Then, click. The call button on the bed pressed itself, glowing red at the nurse's station. And behind her, the breathing grew heavier. The paranormal moment monitor beeps although machine is unplugged. Her heart pounded as the call button light glowed red, the faint breathing still clinging to the back of her neck. She stumbled toward the door, desperate to get out of room 6, when another sound cut through the air. Beep, beep, beep. She froze. It was the sound of a heart monitor, sharp, rhythmic, echoing against the walls like a living pulse. But every monitor in room 6 had been disconnected hours ago. The machines were dark, their wires neatly coiled, their screens blank. There was nothing left to beep. She turned, wide-eyed, and stared at the machine nearest the bed. The screen was glowing green. Numbers flickered across it. A flat line shifted upward, then steadied into a weak but undeniable heartbeat. Beep, beep, beep. Her breath caught in her chest. This was impossible. She stepped closer, almost against her will, drawn toward the machine. The power cord dangled loosely from the back, not plugged into the wall. The monitor was dead, and yet, there it was. A pulse, a patient's rhythm, and then her blood ran cold. On the screen, where a patient's name should be, glowing letters began to form. Slowly, one by one. Help me. The sound of the beeping grew faster, more frantic. Beep, 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 beep. The nurse stumbled backward, her chair clattering against the wall as she rushed for the door. But the machine kept screaming behind her, alarms wailing as though someone's heart was crashing. The door slammed shut before she could reach it. The room plunged suffocating silence into and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the monitor went dark, screen blank, beeping gone, powerless. The machine sat as it had all night, cold, unplugged, silent. But the nurse knew what she'd seen, what she'd heard, and when she finally pulled the door open and fled back into the hall, she could still hear it faintly, echoing in her ears. Beep, 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 the sound of a heart that shouldn't exist anymore. The paranormal moment, the shadow by the bed. The ICU nurse gripped the edge of the doorway, her pulse hammering in her ears. The monitor had gone dark again, as if nothing had ever happened. The room was quiet, too quiet. But then she saw it. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. Shadows often danced in these rooms under fluorescent lights. But no, this wasn't the flicker of a bulb or the bend of a curtain. It was a shape, a figure, standing at the side of the bed. Her mouth went dry. The shadow wasn't tall like a staff member, nor faint like a trick of the light. It had form, shoulders, a head, arms, the unmistakable outline of someone standing exactly where a patient would have stood if they had risen from the bed. The problem was, the man who had lain in that bed was gone. He had died hours before. She had zipped the body bag herself. She had watched the gurney roll out through those double doors. Her whispered, "Hello?" knees into trembled. She the emptiness. The figure didn't move. The room remained still, except for the faint sway of the IV tubing above the bed, as though stirred by a breeze that didn't exist. She blinked hard twice, hoping the shape would vanish with her fatigue, but it didn't. Once, if anything, it shifted. The shadow leaned forward, bending slightly, as though studying the bed. Her throat tightened. She wanted to run, but her feet refused. The air in the room was heavy, pressing against her chest. Then the sound came again, breathing. Not from her, not from the hall, but from that shape. Each inhale shallow, rattling. The same ragged sound the patient had made before the moment of death. Her body stiffened. Memories flooded her mind. The way he had clutched the call button in his final moments, his lips mouthing pleas though no sound escaped. And now, here he was, or something wearing the echo of him. The shadow shifted again, closer to the bed rail now. She could see its hand, long, thin fingers, reaching out toward the call button still clipped at the bedside. Click. The button depressed on its own. At the station, the light for room 6 glowed bright red. Her breath hitched. She forced stumbling into locked on the slowly swung shut, the faint glow of the behind her. Herself back, the hall, eyes figure. The door leaving only red light. The other nurses stared as she staggered to the station, pale, trembling. She tried to explain, but no words came. And then, in the silence of the corridor, a voice broke through. Faint, raspy, barely above a whisper. It came from room 6. I pressed the button. Why didn't you come? Her blood ran cold, because the voice belonged to the man who had died 6 hours earlier. The aftermath. Nurse refuses to work that wing alone again. Soon, by the time the morning shift arrived, she looked like she had aged years in a single night. Her hand still trembled as she signed off her notes, eyes refusing to meet the door at the end of the hall. The board was quiet now, no lights glowing, no phantom alarms. The ICU had returned to its sterile silence, but she knew better. That silence wasn't peace, it was waiting. When her supervisor asked why she was pale and distracted, she didn't answer. How could she explain it? How could she describe a shadow pressing the call button? How could she convince anyone that she'd heard a dead man's voice? The other nurses didn't need convincing. They had seen her stumble from the room. They had heard the alarms blaring, and some admitted later that they too had felt the faint breath of something unseen moving through the hall that night. And so, an unspoken rule was born. From that night on, she refused to work that wing alone. If room 6 lit up again, someone else had to go with her. Most nights, nobody volunteered. They would wait until 2, sometimes 3 nurses gathered before anyone dared to cross that threshold. Even then, they never lingered. Whispers spread quickly, as they always do in hospitals. New staff were warned about room 6. They said the patient who died there never really left, that his desperation to be noticed, to be helped, anchored him to the call light he had clutched with his last breath. Some claimed it was grief. Others said trauma leaves an imprint, a memory so strong that it bleeds into the living. But those who worked the graveyard shift swore it was more than memory. Because sometimes, long after the halls had gone still, the red light on the board would flicker, and the faint sound of a call bell could be heard ringing from a room that no longer had a patient. And even now, years later, nurses will look at each other and say the same thing whenever room 6 calls. Don't go in there alone. Do you hear that ringing in your head too? If you're brave enough to keep listening, prove it. Subscribe right now, and if you won't, go to the comments and tell us why. Maybe the rest of us should know what's keeping you from clicking. She stood frozen, staring at the bed where no one should have been. The shadow lingered, motionless, as if it knew she could see it. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The monitor went dark. The silence was crushing. By morning, she had made her decision. Never again would she take that hallway alone. Even today, if you ask her, she'll tell you. She'd rather switch shifts than set foot in that ICU past midnight. And now I want to ask you, be honest, if you were in her shoes, would you have stayed in that room to investigate? Or would you have run the second the call light flickered? Story 2. The morgue elevator setup. It was just after midnight, deep in the hospital's basement. Down there, beneath the busy wings and patient wards, silence pressed in like a heavy weight. The morgue, a place most staff avoided unless absolutely necessary. The faint hum of the ventilation system was the only sound, broken occasionally by the distant clank of old pipes that had been there since the building's earliest days. The security guard, James, had worked this shift for years. He wasn't easily rattled. But every time he stepped into that basement, he said the air felt wrong. Not just cold, but heavy, as if something unseen was standing close, watching. That night, James had a simple task: escort a maintenance worker who needed access to the locked boiler room near the morgue. Once the worker signed out and left, James was alone again. Alone, with only one way back upstairs, the freight elevator. This wasn't a normal elevator. It was massive, designed to carry gurneys and medical equipment. Its walls were dented from decades of use, paint chipped, a faint smell of rust and disinfectant clinging to the metal. The overhead light flickered occasionally, and the doors creaked as if they resented opening. James pressed the button. The hum of machinery groaned awake, and the elevator slowly descended. He watched the floor numbers tick down. 3, 2, 1. The door slid open, and he stepped inside, feeling the familiar shiver crawl up his arms. As the doors closed, the silence deepened. James leaned against the cold railing, rubbing his eyes. It was routine, just another ride to the main floor. But when he glanced at the control panel, he froze. The button for the basement morgue, the very level he was already leaving, was lit up. Someone had pressed it. James, he hadn't touched elevator, was supposed to go up. But instead, the machinery groaned, and the elevator began to descend again. Frowned. Back to the morgue. Elevator doors opened by themselves. The elevator lurched to a stop. The old gears rattled in protest, echoing through the shaft like distant chains being dragged. James held his breath as the heavy steel doors creaked open. The morgue stretched out before him, dimly lit, lined with white tiles that seemed to glow faintly under the sickly fluorescent lights. The air rolled in, colder than the basement should ever be. He hadn't pressed anything. He hadn't called for this. For a long moment, James didn't move. His instincts told him to step back to slam the door close button. But his body wouldn't listen. The elevator stood there waiting, its doors held wide, as though inviting something inside. James forced a shaky laugh under his breath. Probably just a wiring glitch, he muttered. But deep down he knew better. He had taken this ride hundreds of times. The elevator never did this on its own. Then he noticed it, subtle at first, a shift in the air. The way the fine hairs on his arm rose. It felt like someone was standing just out of sight, just beyond the threshold. The fluorescent light above the morgue corridor flickered once, twice, and then, for less than a heartbeat, it cut out completely. In that instant of darkness, James swore he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps, soft, slow, coming closer. The light snapped back on. The hallway was empty, completely still. But the elevator doors stayed open, as if waiting for whoever or whatever was walking toward him. James shifted on his feet, throat dry. The elevator doors had been open for nearly a full minute now, far longer than the system ever allowed. They should have closed on their own, but they didn't. It felt deliberate, like the elevator was waiting. The faint hum of the basement's lights buzzed in his ears, then flicker. A bulb overhead stuttered. The corridor plunged into shadow for half a second, and in that moment James swore he saw a figure, tall, motionless, standing at the far end of the morgue hallway. When the light steadied again, it was gone. James pressed the door close button with a shaky hand. The doors didn't move. He pressed it again. Nothing. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. The cold air seemed to press against him now, heavy and damp, carrying the faintest smell of formaldehyde. Then, the sound returned. Tap, tap, slow, deliberate, growing louder as if approaching the elevator. James's chest tightened. He reached for his flashlight, fumbling with the switch. The beam cut through the hall and landed on nothing, empty tile. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew closer and closer, until they reached the elevator doors. Then silence. The hairs on James's neck stood straight. He knew something was standing just beyond the threshold. He could feel the presence, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing against his chest. And then, the elevator doors slammed shut on their own, jolting the cabin so hard James nearly fell. For a long second he couldn't breathe. The elevator groaned and lurched upward, carrying him away from the morgue. But just before the doors sealed completely, James caught one last glimpse of the hallway, a pale hand, pressed flat against the outside of the door. And it wasn't his. The elevator that waited at 3:15 a.m. James never believed the rumors. Hospitals, he told himself, were built on strange schedules, endless noises, and tired imaginations. Of course, staff whispered. Of course, stories grew. But then came the elevator. Every night at exactly 3:15 a.m., the service elevator stopped at the morgue floor. No button pressed, no one inside. It would wait there with its doors open, as if expecting someone. Night 1, rationalization. James was a new night shift security guard. His supervisor, Old Marty, had warned him, "Don't take the elevator at 3:15. If you hear it, let it go." James laughed it off. Old man stories, superstitions for exhausted staff. But when 3:15 came, James, half out of boredom, half out of pride, went to see for himself. The sound reached him first. Ding. The elevator announced its arrival, loud and sharp in the dead hallway. He walked slowly, flashlight bobbing along the walls. Sure enough, its doors were open at the morgue floor, light spilling across the tile. Empty. The doors stayed open far too long. Normally they closed automatically after a few seconds. He checked his watch. 1 minute, 2, 3, still open. Then, without warning, slam. The doors shut. The elevator carried on. James forced a chuckle, told himself it was a glitch. A wiring issue. He logged it as a maintenance note. But when he turned to leave, he caught something in the corner of his eye. Down the morgue hallway, a metal gurney rolled a few inches on its own. Night 2. The Whisper. The next night, James told himself he wouldn't check. He wouldn't give the superstition any power. But curiosity gnawed at him. 3:15 came. The ding echoed. This time, James didn't just look. He stepped inside the elevator. The cabin smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else. Something metallic. He pressed lobby. The doors didn't close. He pressed again. Nothing. Then he heard it. A whisper. Low, raspy. Right behind his ear. "Get out." James spun around, light flashing. The elevator was empty. His skin prickled. His throat tightened. He stumbled out onto the morgue floor, shaking. The moment his shoes touched the tile, the elevator doors closed, and it carried itself upward, leaving him stranded in the dark. That's when he realized. The whisper hadn't told him to get out of the elevator. It had told him to get out of the morgue. Night 3. The Pattern. James didn't sleep that day. He spent hours researching. Elevators were mechanical, simple, but this one, it was always 3:15 a.m. sharp, not 3:14, not 3:16, always 3:15. Marty, the supervisor, caught him digging and grew pale. "You fool, you've looked for it, now it'll look for you." James pressed him, demanded answers. Marty muttered one thing before walking away. 3:15, time of death, night 4, the reflection. James was determined to break the cycle. When 3:15 came, he sat in the lobby, refusing to go near the basement. But the sound carried anyway. Ding! The lobby elevator opened, and it wasn't empty. Inside was James, pale, still, dead eyes staring straight ahead. The reflection didn't move when he did. It just stood there, waiting. And then it smiled. The doors closed and the elevator descended on its own. Night 5, the encounter. James couldn't ignore it anymore. His hands shook as he held his flashlight, walking the halls. 3:14. Silence. 3:15. Ding. The elevator waited at the morgue again. Doors open, but this time, it wasn't empty. A gurney stood inside. A white sheet covered a body. James's breath caught in his throat. He took one step closer. The sheet shifted. Something inside moved. The sheet slid off just enough to reveal a hand, pale, blue veins visible under the skin, fingers twitching, and then the hand gripped the elevator rail. James stumbled back, choking on air. The corpse sat up. Its head hung unnaturally to one side, neck twisted. The face, what was left of it, smiled at him. "You're late." The doors began to close with the corpse still inside, but before they sealed, the thing stood, pressing its palm against the edge. The doors jolted back open, and it stepped out. The endless ride. No one saw James after that night. His shift log ended abruptly at 3:14 a.m., but the elevator, it still runs, every night. 3:15 sharp. It always stops at the morgue. The doors always open, and now staff whisper a new detail. Sometimes when the elevator comes back up, there's already someone inside. A security guard, uniform neatly pressed, head twisted to one side, smiling, waiting for you to join him. The paranormal moment. At first, he thought it was the hum of the old machinery, the way the cables groaned when the elevator descended. But then, he realized it wasn't mechanical at all. It was voices, muffled at first, almost like whispers bleeding through the steel doors. A man's low tone, a woman's faint reply. Then, laughter. Soft, childlike. The security guard froze where he stood, his flashlight trembling in his hand. There shouldn't have been anyone in that elevator. He knew it. The cameras confirmed it. And yet, The voices were as real as the beating of his own heart. He leaned in closer. The elevator doors slid open, empty. But the sound didn't stop. It echoed, as if the voices were still trapped inside the shaft, riding unseen between floors. His stomach twisted as the woman's whisper grew sharper, more urgent, and then silence. Not silence like the end of a conversation. Silence that felt intentional, as if whatever had been speaking now knew he was listening. He stepped back, every muscle locked tight, but his ears strained forward. The voices hadn't left, they had only moved. Now they came from behind him. He spun around, empty hallway, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The morgue doors sealed shut at the far end. The voices returned to the elevator shaft, louder this time. Not whispers anymore, but layered, dozens of them, as if a crowd was packed inside that tiny steel box. Men, women, children, all speaking at once, overlapping. Too fast to make out the words, but urgent, frantic, pleading. The guard's chest tightened. Then, just as suddenly, they all stopped. Dead silence. He dared to look up at the floor display above the elevator doors. The numbers were wrong. Instead of floors, it was counting backward. 3, 2, 1, 0, -1, -2. Basement levels that didn't exist. And with number, he swore he heard a single voice cut through the every descending. Silence. A voice that knew his name. It whispered it, soft, clear, almost kind, as though inviting him to step inside. But he didn't move. He couldn't, because deep down he realized something. If he answered, the elevator wouldn't stop at the morgue floor anymore. It would take him wherever they were. One night, a stretcher is seen rolling out with no one pushing it. That night, he promised himself he wouldn't look. But curiosity is a crueler master than fear. 3:15 a.m., the chime echoed through the empty corridors. The elevator doors slid open on their own. He stood frozen at his desk, forcing himself not to move. Then he heard it, the faint metallic rattle of wheels on tile. At first he thought it was imagination, until he saw it. A hospital stretcher, rolling out of the elevator, slowly, smoothly, as if an invisible hand guided it. No nurses, no orderlies, no one behind it. The guard's throat went dry. He watched it glide past him, the wheels squeaking faintly with every turn. It stopped, just a few feet away. The white sheet covering its surface was stained, something dark soaking through. And though no one was lying on it, the sheet sagged, as if something heavy pressed it down from beneath. He took one step back, then another. His body screamed to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The stretcher shuddered, a violent jolt, as if something beneath the sheet had just moved. And then, slowly, deliberately, the sheet began to slide off on its own. The sheet slid halfway down the stretcher before stopping. The guard's breath caught in his throat. He didn't need to see what was beneath. His eyes, his face, said it all. His pupils widened. His lips trembled as if he were about to scream, but nothing came out. He stumbled back into the wall, clutching his chest, his flashlight, beam shaking wildly across the empty hallway. And then, he did something he'd never done in 20 years of night shifts. He dropped his radio. The heavy plastic cracked on the tile, the sound echoing far louder than it should have in the silence. He turned away, refusing to look back at the stretcher. His body shook as if the air itself had turned to ice. Behind him, the wheels squeaked again, not rolling away. Closer, each turn of the measured, deliberate wheels. He squeezed his eyes shut, whispering to himself over and over, "Don't look, don't look, don't look." The squeaking stopped, a silence so heavy it pressed on his chest. And in that silence, a whisper, not from the hallway, not from the elevator, from directly beside him. Just one word. If you're watching this alone right now, and that bell kept ringing in your mind too, you need to subscribe, because if you don't, tonight when you close your eyes, you'll hear it again in the dark. Go ahead, subscribe now, or prove me wrong in the comments. Aftermath. Guard quits his job after 6 months. He lasted 6 more months. 6 months of carrying that memory like a weight pressing into his chest. 6 months of avoiding the third-floor corridor, of refusing to take the elevator past midnight. The other guards noticed. His hands always shook when he signed the logbook. His eyes darted to shadows that no one else saw. He'd flinch when a stretcher daylight rolled by even in, and when someone called his name, just his name, he froze every single time. Finally, one morning, he turned in his badge and walked out of the hospital. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't explain. But the nurses whispered that when he handed over his uniform, he made one strange request. "Don't let them put me near the elevators," he said. Not even for a second. 6 months later, they still say his old post is cursed. The elevator still stops at the morgue floor at exactly 3:15 a.m., no button pressed. And sometimes, the security camera catches a figure standing in the hall, watching, always by the stretcher. They say spirits don't always rest where they're buried. Some linger, close to the last place their body was seen. And if that's true, if those voices in the elevator, those footsteps in the hall, and that stretcher rolling on its own were real, then maybe the morgue isn't just a room for the dead. Maybe it's a waiting room for what's left of them. What do you think? Do you believe spirits follow their bodies to the morgue? Story 3. The Ghost Child in Pediatrics. I've worked in pediatrics for almost a decade, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that nights in a children's ward are not like nights anywhere else. During the day, the wing is alive with motion, parents shuffling in and out, doctors doing rounds, children laughing or crying, sometimes both at the same time. Even with sickness in the air, there's a warmth to it, a kind of fragile hope you can almost touch. But at night, everything changes. The colors seem to drain from the walls. The laughter disappears. The lights hum just a little too loudly, and every sound echoes in a way that makes you wonder if you're really alone. I remember my first night shift. The pediatric wing was at half capacity, half of the rooms empty, doors closed, lights dimmed. I told myself it was just another job, just another floor, in just another hospital. But pediatrics has its own atmosphere, one you can't compare to the ICU, or the ER, or even the morgue. It's the silence, the way it creeps in after visiting hours end. Parents go home, the children drift into sleep, and suddenly the entire floor belongs to you. You walk past rows of small beds, cartoon stickers peeling from the walls, stuffed animals resting against pillows. Every detail whispers innocence. But the silence presses down with a weight you can't explain. The hardest part? Knowing that not every child gets better. Some of those tiny beds are left empty not because a patient went home, but because they didn't make it through the night. And that's the thing no one tells you in nursing school. That sometimes the silence in pediatrics isn't peaceful. It feels like it's waiting. The pediatric ward was built decades ago, long before I started. The tiles are old, the air vents rattle when the heating kicks in, and the walls are paper thin. You can hear whispers from rooms down the hall, machines beeping 2 doors away. At night, when everything calms down, those sounds blur together until you can't tell what's real and what's your mind filling in the gaps. Most nurses hate the night shift. The pay's a little better, sure, but the trade-off is hours of walking dark hallways, checking on sleeping patients, filling charts under flickering fluorescent lights. You learn to tune out a lot. The distant coughs, the creaks of settling pipes, the way the old elevator always shudders before it opens. But there's one thing you can never tune out. The feeling of being watched. I used to brush it off, tell myself it was fatigue, or just the stress of working too many shifts back to back. But in pediatrics, the feeling has a way of following you. You feel it when you check vitals at 2 in the morning. You feel it when you refill medication under the glow of the hallway lights. You feel it when you sit at the nurse's station, staring down a long, empty corridor that seems darker than it should be. And deep down, you know it's not just your imagination. Because every nurse in pediatrics has a story. Stories they only whisper during breaks when no one else is listening. Stories about doors opening by themselves, toys being found moved in the morning, children talking to someone who isn't there. I never believed them, not at first. Until the night I heard the laughter. and realized that sometimes, not every child leaves this hospital when their body does. The pediatrics wing at night is nothing like it is in the daytime. During the day, the halls are filled with chatter, little feet running, the soft hum of monitors, and parents whispering to their children. But at night, it's different. The laughter is gone, the silence is heavy, and the dimmed lights throw long shadows that seem to stretch far too long against the walls. You saw that in your mind just now, didn't you? That child-shaped shadow? If you did, then you've already let the story inside your head. Don't leave it wandering in there alone. Subscribe before it follows you somewhere darker. It was during one of these nights that I began my shift. The ward was unusually quiet, too quiet. Every room was empty, freshly cleaned, beds tucked, curtains drawn. No patients were assigned to this wing that week, and yet, the entire space was kept lit, as though waiting. I remember pausing at the nurse's station, sipping lukewarm coffee, glancing down the hallway. It stretched into a dim tunnel, lined with doors that hid nothing but stillness. At least, that's what I thought. It started giggling, with the sound of faint, light, almost playful. The kind of laugh you'd expect from a toddler hiding behind a curtain during a game of peekaboo. But there were no children in the ward. The first time, I told myself it was the old pipes, or maybe the echo of a TV from a distant wing. But when I turned the corner, I froze. A single rubber ball, bright red, was sitting in the middle of the hallway. I hadn't seen it there before, and as I stood staring at it, I swore I heard the faintest tap, 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 as though someone's tiny hand was drumming on the wall just out of sight. The silence that followed pressed against me, thick and suffocating. The paranormal moment. I bent down to pick up the ball, but before my hand touched it, it rolled slowly away from me. Not bouncing, not thrown, just rolling, deliberate, purposeful. And then, from one of the empty rooms, I heard the sound of a child humming, a lullaby, old, familiar, but slightly off-key. I stepped toward the door, my pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I pushed the door open, the humming stopped. The bed inside was perfectly made. The window curtains swayed slightly, though the window itself was locked shut, and on the pillow sat a small stuffed bear, its button eye missing, facing the door. I told myself I was tired, overtired. Maybe I had dozed off at the station without realizing. Maybe the coffee was messing with me. But then I saw it, a reflection in the window glass. Not mine, not anyone's. A small figure, standing near the bed. A child, no taller than my waist, but when I spun around, no one was there. The bear, though, had fallen onto the floor. I didn't hear it fall. I didn't see it move. It was just there, at my feet. And when I bent down to pick it up, the faint giggle returned. This time, right by my ear. So close I could feel the breath. That was the moment I lost my composure. I backed into the hallway, my hands shaking, and every fluorescent light above me flickered, one after the other, like a wave of failing electricity. And then I saw it, the ball, rolling toward me again, slowly, carefully. But this time, it stopped at my feet, and I heard a whisper, a child's voice, clear as day. "Will you play with me?" My legs gave out, and I stumbled against the wall. When I looked back at the door of the empty room, it was no longer empty. The curtains swayed. Bed covers were rumpled, though something small crawled beneath them. The ass had. And the humming started again, this time louder. Aftermath. I left the pediatrics wing that night and refused to work a solo night shift there ever again. The others on staff, they've heard it too. Some claim to have seen the child. Some say it's just imagination, the stress of working nights. But I know what I heard, I know what I felt, and sometimes, when I pass that wing even in daylight, I catch a glimpse of a little hand pressed against the glass of an empty window. What do you think? Do children's spirits linger in the places they suffered most? Or was it just exhaustion playing tricks on me? Story 4: The Disappearing Patient, the Routine Night Doctor's POV. I've worked night shifts most of my career. There's a rhythm to it. The hallways are quieter, the overhead lights are softer, and you start to recognize the little sounds, the hum of machines, the squeak of a nurse's shoes, the rattle of meal carts being pushed back to the kitchen. That night was no different, at first. We had admitted an elderly woman, late 70s, frail but sharp-eyed, room 409. I remember her because she smiled at me when I checked in. Her voice was weak, but she said something that stuck with me. Don't let me be alone too long. Hospitals are full of lonely people, but there was something about the way she said it. Almost like she knew something was waiting for her when the room went quiet. Around midnight, I made my rounds. When I reached 409, the door was cracked open just slightly. The lights inside were dimmed, casting long shadows over the bed. I peeked in and froze. The bed was neatly made, sheets tucked in, no patient. I thought maybe she'd been moved. It happens sometimes if a patient needs more monitoring, but there was no note, no transfer order, and her chart was still clipped at the end of the bed, untouched. I asked the nurses station, but they looked at me blankly. No one's moved her, they said. She should still be in 409. I went back, the room was empty. But here's what unsettled me most. The indentation of a body was still on the mattress, as if someone had been lying there moments before. Paranormal moment, the return. I decided to check the bathroom. Empty. Closet. Empty. I stepped into the hallway, scanning for a patient wandering. Sometimes the elderly get disoriented at night, but the hall was silent. And then, as I turned back, I saw movement inside 409. The old woman was back, lying in the bed, eyes closed, breathing slow. I stood there for a moment, unable to process it. Did I just miss her? Did she slip past me somehow? But no, her chart was exactly where I left it, and the air felt wrong. Cold, I walked closer. "Mrs. Delaney?" I whispered. Her eyes snapped open wide, staring right at me, but she didn't speak, didn't move, just stared until I felt my skin crawl. I backed out of the room, pretending I had somewhere urgent to be. Or the escalation disappearances. Over the next week, the same thing kept happening. She would vanish. Sometimes I'd walk past 409 and see the bed empty, sheets folded down neatly, as if no one had ever touched them. Minutes later, she'd be back in the same position. Eyes closed, breathing shallow. The nurses began whispering about it. "You sure she isn't on oxygen?" one asked. "Sometimes hypoxia makes them wander, but no, she was too frail to walk far. And besides, where would she go?" One night I caught sight of her down the hallway, just a flicker. A pale gown, slow dragging steps. I hurried after her, heart pounding. The hall bent around the corner. Empty. When I returned to 409, she was in bed again, exactly as before, like she had never left. Eventually, I confronted her. "Mrs. Delaney," I said, trying to keep my tone clinical calm, "do you remember leaving your room?" Her lips twitched into a faint smile. "I go where I'm called," she whispered. "Called by who?" Her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Then she turned her gaze to me. "Sometimes the dead don't like to be alone either." I felt a chill rush through me. That night I couldn't shake the sound of her voice. I kept replaying her words. I checked her vitals obsessively. Blood pressure, pulse, oxygen saturation, all stable. She wasn't delirious, she wasn't confused. So why did I believe her? Final vanishing. 3 weeks later, it happened for the last time. I came to 409 at 3:10 a.m., bed empty, sheets tucked in tight. This time, though, there was something else. The heart monitor still attached to the wall was flatlining. A long, steady beep. But the leads, the wires, were hanging loose, not attached to anyone. I ran my hand over the bed, cold, and then I heard it. From the bathroom. Voice, whispering my name. I froze in the doorway. The mirror above the sink reflected the room, but not me. No, that's not quite right. It reflected the bed. And in that reflection, she was still lying there, eyes open, watching me. I didn't check the bathroom. I didn't stay. I pulled the door shut and walked away. Aftermath, the unresolved truth. The next morning I asked about her. The nurse looked at me strangely. "Doctor, there is no patient in 409. That room has been closed for months." I went back myself, refusing to believe it. Room 409 was stripped bare. No bed, no monitor, just 4 blank walls and a faint outline on the floor where a bed had once stood. I never worked that floor again. And I never learned whether Mrs. Delaney was real, or if she had been gone all along. If heart's racing right now, that's not just fear, it's a warning. Subscribing means you've joined the safe side of the screen. Refuse, and maybe tonight you'll hear your name spoken in an empty room. If you won't subscribe, at least confess in the comments why you're risking it. You're still watching your question, so tell me, if you were in my position, would you have stepped into that bathroom? Or would you have done what? Did? Walk away and never look back. 5. The last patient in the emergency room. The emergency room at 4 in the morning is unlike any other place on Earth. The fluorescent lights hum faintly above, the smell of disinfectant lingers in the air, and silence fills every corner, except for the occasional beep of a monitor, or the slow shuffle of tired footsteps. For most people, this is the graveyard shift. But for me, this was home. I was an ER nurse, trained to expect anything. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. The night we began to speak of. Last patient. First signs. It was 4:03 a.m. when he walked in. A man, mid-30s, clutching his abdomen, blood soaking through his shirt. His face was pale, his steps unsteady. But what struck me most were his eyes, wide, hollow, as if he had already seen the other side. Instinct took over. I rushed forward, wheeling him to a bed in trauma room 2. His breathing was shallow, ragged. "Stay with me," I whispered, as I tore open packages of gauze, applying pressure to the wound. He didn't speak much, just murmured, almost like he was apologizing for something. His lips moved faintly, but the words never fully formed. I thought I heard, "Not supposed to be here," but I wasn't sure. I leaned in closer, trying to catch his words, when his hand gripped my wrist. Ice cold, colder than skin should ever be. And then he said, clearer this time, "Don't. Them take me back." A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. Patients say strange things under shock. I needed more supplies, IV lines, saline clamps. Told him I'd be right back and stepped into the hallway. The entire walk to the supply closet felt wrong, too quiet. Even in the slowest hours, you hear something. Paperwork being shuffled, the distant wheels of a gurney, the faint chatter of night staff. This time, nothing. Just silence pressing against my ears. I grabbed what I needed and hurried back. The bed was empty, the blood-stained sheets still. There, the monitor still beeping as though connected to someone. But the patient himself, gone. At first I thought maybe he'd staggered out, disoriented, but no. A man in that state couldn't have made it far. I checked the hallways, the bathrooms, every corner. He had vanished. The paranormal moment, CCTV review. My heart pounding, I called security. Within minutes, the night guard, a man named Harris, joined me. Together, we combed the ER. Still nothing. Then Harris suggested reviewing the security cameras. We pulled up the footage, timestamped to the exact moment I remembered him walking in. The sliding glass doors opened, but no one entered. The hallways showed nothing. Trauma room 2, empty. But here's the part that still makes my blood run cold. On the recording, you can see me, talking, moving, working with urgency, talking to no one, bandaging air, adjusting wires to machines connected to an empty bed. I begged Harris to rewind, to slow it down. But it was the same, over and over, me, treating a ghost. He turned to me, pale as paper, and whispered, "Do you know who you just described? Because I do." The identity of the patient. That's when Harris told me the story. Years before I joined the hospital, there had been a car crash on the highway. A man in his 30s was brought in, bleeding heavily from the abdomen. Hadn't made it past the ER doors. Harris remembered it vividly, because he was the one who had wheeled the body inside. He swore the description matched perfectly. Same face, same pale stare, same bloodied shirt. I didn't want to believe him. I couldn't. So I dug into the records, and there it was. A John Doe, brought in at 4:03 a.m. nearly a decade earlier. Officially pronounced dead before treatment could even begin. But somehow, that night, he had come back. Or maybe fatigue was twisting my mind. But then other nurses began to speak. But it was over. That I had imagined it, or that. One swore she had seen the same man leaning against the ER counter weeks later, holding his stomach, before vanishing when she blinked. Other claimed she felt icy fingers brush against her arm while standing in trauma room 2. Even doctors admitted odd things, monitors spiking with readings though no patient was connected. Gurneys rolling slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. And every time, always around 4 a.m., it wasn't just me. We all knew something was wrong. The man, still here, still returning, desperate perhaps for a treatment he never received, or for someone to finally acknowledge his pain. From that night on, the ER felt different. Whenever I worked the graveyard shift, I could feel it. Eyes watching from the corner, shadows shifting just a second too late. Sometimes I'd hear the sliding doors open, but no one walked in. Times from trauma room 2, I'd hear the faint sound of groaning, like a man trying to speak through a blood-filled throat. And sometimes I would smell it. Sharp coppery scent of blood, stronger than the disinfectant, even when every bed was empty. Aftermath. The staff stopped calling him by his name. Instead, he became known as the last patient, because in a way, he never really left. His body may have been taken to the morgue years ago, but something about him stayed behind, trapped within the walls of the ER. Some believe he returns because he died waiting for help that never came in time. Others think he's searching for a way to finally cross over, clinging to the last place he ever knew. I know is this: I saw him, I treated him, and the memory of his cold hand on my wrist still haunts me. So if you ever find yourself in a hospital ER at 4 in the morning, closely, listen carefully, and if you feel a hand grip yours, colder than death itself, you might have just met the last patient. The staff called him the last patient, but who says he's truly the last? If you believe hospitals hold the souls of the forgotten, subscribe now. If you don't, give your courage in the comments and tell us why you won't. But remember, courage and foolishness often look the same until the night proves the difference. Do you believe the spirits of the dead return to the places where they suffered most? Or was I simply losing my mind that night? You decide. Hospitals are where science and compassion meet, where doctors stitch together broken bodies, where nurses fight against the ticking clock, where hope is meant to live. If you've stayed with me through tonight's stories, you already know there's another side to these walls, a side where silence weighs heavier than words. Shadows stretch longer than they should, where every flicker of light feels like a warning, not a glitch. Let's go back, just for a moment. Do you remember the elevator doors? By themselves? As if someone, or something, was patiently waiting to step inside. Or the guard in the morgue, his voice trembling as he swore he heard whispers, and then watched a stretcher roll out. One there to push it? He lasted only 6 months before quitting, 6 months before he couldn't take it anymore. And then there was the ghost child in pediatrics. Sound of giggles echoing in an empty ward, a bouncing ball rolling across the floor, with no hand to guide it. The nurse still insists she tucked a blanket around a little boy who, according to the hospital records, died weeks earlier. And who could forget the vanishing patient in room 409? Checked in, charted, spoken to, only to disappear without a trace. Doctors, nurses, even security staff swore he existed until the files proved otherwise. Room 409 remains one of the least requested rooms in the hospital. And then, the story that chills me the most, the last patient in the ER, a man bleeding, desperate, collapsing on the bed, the nurse rushing for supplies, only to return and find an empty room. The CCTV revealing she was speaking to no one. His description matching a patient who died in a car crash years before. The ER staff still whisper his name, the last patient, and sometimes, at 4 a.m., they swear they hear him calling for help. All of these stories, different voices, different places, different nights. But one thread ties them together. Hospitals don't just treat the living, they hold the memories, the echoes, and the spirits of those who never truly left. So the next time you find yourself in a hospital after dark, when the hallways are empty, when the air feels too still, when the silence is broken by a sound you can't explain, ask yourself, are you really alone? Because hospitals save lives every day, but at night, they keep the souls that never left. Which story creeped you out the most? Let me know in the comments. If you want more real horror stories, hit the subscribe button, like, comment, and share.